In this video, I will demonstrate the installation of an anchor nut and describe the various tools that you can use to do that job. First, I prepared a little test coupon, similar to what you would be installing in your airfoil section. See the layout I've done here with a compass to make sure that I've accurately located the spots where the anchor nut screws need to be. So I've got myself a number 40 drill bit, and I'll drill right into this piece of wood. And install a cleco. You wouldn't normally be doing this because you would be in your airfoil, not drilling into a piece of wood. So once you've completed locating the anchor nuts, where they're going to be located, then you would select the correct anchor nut. Now, there's a whole variety of anchor nuts, just for your information. Here's a little sampling of the different styles and sizes, and it all depends upon the application where you want these anchor nuts, which are sometimes called nut plates, to be installed. Here I've got a shelf in an avionics bay of an aircraft, and it's got all kinds of anchor nuts installed for the various equipment that would be installed on the shelf. I'll show you the back side here, and you can see these anchor nuts. The attached rivets are placed very close to the threaded section in the anchor nut. A variety of tools can be used to install anchor nuts. The main thing you're striving for is to get the anchor nut attach holes evenly spaced on either side of the center hole where the fastener is going to be going in. And so we can use tools to help us do that. Now what I have here, I've installed a screw or a bolt into the anchor nut and cut the head off, so it allows me to have a homemade tool. Here's another example of a homemade tool for a smaller anchor nut. This is a fiber lock nut. Put a screw in there, cut the head off, grinder smooth, and now I can use it to locate the two anchor nut attach rivets. We're going to be installing 4 anchor nuts of the fixed anchor nut style. So the screw goes into the hole, needs to be located very accurately. And I'll be installing 2 of these we call floating anchor nuts. Now this one here, the nut actually floats inside the plate, which secures it. Here's another style, and the holes are very close together on this one here, as opposed to this one here. The holes are a lot further apart. So it's important that we select the correct tool. A variety of tools that are used called nut plate jigs, and just as there are a variety of anchor nuts, there's a variety of nut plate jigs, and they come with different sizes of pilot. And you have a large pilot here, and different spacings of holes. Some of the holes are spaced close together, and some of the holes are spaced further apart. And obviously, sometimes the attached nuts are all on one side of the nut plate, so you'd have to have a jig that would accommodate that. So selecting the correct jig is very important. So this is the jig that we have in our shop and we're using. And to prepare to use this jig, I want to make sure that I drill the correct size hole for where the screw is going to go through. So I got the jig which matches the nut plate that I'm going to be installing, the spacing. It's got the correct spacing, and it's the same spacing for a fixed anchor nut as for a floating anchor nut. The attached rivets are the same distance apart. You can use a ruler to measure them, the distance between the rivets, 3/4 of an inch, and you could lay that out onto your sheet, measuring 3/4 of an inch and drawing a line. That's I guess that would be the way if you had no available tools and you couldn't make one, that'd be a way you could do. I wouldn't recommend that. I recommend using a tool, even if it has to be a homemade tool. So I've got my anchor nut jig, the correct jig for the anchor nuts that I'll be installing, and now I want to figure out what size hole to use the jig. I have a hole gauge here, and I can slide it along, and I see that the pilot in the anchor nut jig is a number 20. It fits in a number 20 hole, so it's a 5/32 inch diameter pilot, and for that reason I want to make a hole which is just slightly larger so it doesn't bind in the material as I'm using the tool. So what I have selected is a drill bit with a number 19 drill bit in it. And I plug this in. Now I've got pilot holes all locating where the screws are going to be going. Now I enlarge those pilot holes. To a 5/32 size, number 19 drill bit. I'm going to grab a 5/32 Cleco, a black one, replace the silver ones. 3/32 Clecos. And continue drilling all the way around. Always keep your drill perpendicular to the work surface, whatever you're working on. If it's a slanted airfoil skin or it's a flat plate, keep it perpendicular. So I've got all my holes drilled where the screws are going to go through, and I've got them all drilled to a number 19 size. This will allow me to use the anchor nut jig. I'm using the jig. You'll notice that there's one little pin sticking out on this side as well as the pilot. Flip it over. On the other side I have no pin sticking out and just the pilot sticking out. So that would be the side that I'd be using first. And I'll lay it down onto my material. And when I'm doing the ones in the corner, I like to put them so that the anchor nut attach holes will be the same distance from the edge of the inside hole. And if I'm using the arc that I made when I'm doing my radius, laying out the location, then I can just kind of align that. It's not real critical, but I just like to have it so that it's a little bit balanced for appearance sake. So I've got my anchor nut jig down there, and there's a drill bushing on the one side, and that's the side I'll start with. Push down firmly. I got a number 40 hole in there. Remove the anchor nut jig. Flip it over so that the pin now goes in the hole that I just drilled. And push it all the way down so it sits onto the material. Now I've got a piece of plywood here, so it's a little hard to push down. And drill the second hole. I'm going to use a pair of pliers to help me lift this thing out of here because it's a little tight. It'll come. You won't have this difficulty because you're not drilling into a piece of plywood. So I've got two holes which are exactly spaced the same distance from the center hole, and I've got them in alignment to the desired location I wanted. Whip over here, once again place the side that doesn't have a stud sticking out of it, and line it up with the line. Grab my number 40 drill bit. Put a hole in there. Cleat goes in the way. Turn it this way so you can see it. Now I got the little pin. I'm going to put it in that hole that I just drilled and repeat the process. Use my pliers, work it out. I can put the cleat over here now. And I'm repeating the process for all the holes. Line it up. Drill the first hole. So as you can see here, pull this cleat out. I've got attached holes all the way around, evenly spaced on each side of the center hole where the screw goes through. And now I'm going to have to countersink these holes. Just like the antenna shelf here, the equipment that's going to be sitting on top has to sit flush to the shelf. So anchor nuts are almost always installed with flush style rivets. So I take micro stock cut countersink, which I've already pre-set up with a number 40 pilot, and I make sure it's nice and sharp and clean. And I've still got this clamped to the plywood so nothing is moving. And now I'm going to prepare the holes. Little 332 flush rivets. Now I've placed masking tape on this one here for demonstration purposes. If you've taken the protective plastic off your airfoil and placed masking tape on, remember to remove the masking tape before you do any riveting operation. Let's pull the cleat goes out just so you can see better what's happening here. Now, I've got these holes pilot drilled, the anchor nut holes where the screws are going to go through, to number 19, and I've already countersunk the attached holes. So now I want to open up these holes to a size which will allow clearance for the screw that I'm using. So I'm using a number 8 screw for the number 8 anchor nut. So I could fit it through that number 19 hole, but I want to have a little bit of clearance. So I'll select a drill motor and a drill bit with a number 17 drill, which is just a little bit larger than 19. And this demonstration and for our shop project, we like to install 2 styles of anchor nuts. We use the fixed anchor nuts in 4 locations around the panel, and I use 2 floating anchor nuts on either end of the panel. And I'll just explain to you here what that difference that means. So when I'm drilling a number 17 drill bit, I'll only be drilling it through the locations where the fixed anchor nuts are going to go. And in this case here, it'll be these 4 holes. So these 4 holes get opened up to number 17. And the other 2 holes, because there's a floating anchor nut that gets installed in those, and we can have a larger hole to allow for more misalignment, we'll use the number 13 drill bit for those 2. So I have a 13 drill bit through here, going through the skin and your doubler. You want to have your doubler installed underneath your skin at this time, because these are final size holes. And there you have it. I've got all my holes drilled, prepared for riveting. So I'm going to take off the plastic, like you should. Take off the masking tape, that I've used to protect the skin with. Let's take half it off for now. Get a 3/32 inch rivets, and I got to figure out what's the correct size. So I stick the rivet in the hole. Here I'm going to stick 2 rivets in the hole. Rotate the sheet over, put my anchor nut on, and see how it fits nice and neatly on those 2 rivets. And now I should have 1.5 diameter sticking out past the nut plate. So just by visually looking at it or using a ruler and measuring it, you want to make sure that you have 1.5 diameters of rivet, so I've got the correct length rivet. So now I know I've selected the correct length rivet. We're going to install the anchor nuts. 3/32 inch cleco. I'll stick it through the anchor nut attach hole, and hopefully you can see that. And then I'll put the anchor nut onto the cleco, release the cleco, rotate the anchor nut so that it now aligns with the other attach hole. Having a little pick like this could come in handy to get it stuck in the hole. Stick a rivet in the hole that I've just aligned. Take a look on the back side. You can see that it's in the correct location. Always check the back side, because people have riveted the rivet and missed the nut plate. That does happen from time to time. So I've got a hand squeezer set up here now. You're familiar with using a hand squeezer. And many of us like to protect our aluminum skin as we're riveting. So in this instance here, I'll just use a small piece of masking tape, place it over top of the rivet. Piece of sword in it to protect the skin. Squeeze riveter. Sneak it in here. Now you can see the other side here. I got the squeeze riveter, and I'll center it. I want to make sure I have the squeeze riveter so that the die is not hitting the anchor nut threaded area. It's just on the rivet. And then I'll squeeze it on down. And if I have it properly set, I'll have a beautifully formed rivet on that side, and it's sitting nice and flush on the other side. Take the cleco out, stick the second rivet in. Use the same piece of masking tape or another piece of masking tape. Cover the rivet. Repeat the process. Make sure I miss the threaded portion. Now you may even have to use a mirror sometimes, but generally you can just put your finger through and feel the back structure on the aircraft, and then squeeze it on down. And there I've got an anchor nut installed for a number 8 screw, and it's a fixed anchor nut. So I have to be fairly precise with the location of the cover panel on top to locate that one. For the floating anchor nut, I've opened the center attach hole to 13, which will give me more clearance. And I'll just demonstrate that one. Once again, put the cleco through the hole. Take your anchor nut, your floating anchor nut, place it onto the cleco, release the cleco, rotate the anchor nut around so that it aligns with the, use my little pick to align the hole. Install a rivet. Put a piece of masking tape on to hold the rivet in place. Squeeze riveter. Now, this is the trick. you got to make sure that the die doesn't hit these little flanges right here that allow the nut portion to float. If you squeeze those down, this will become like a fixed anchor nut, and it'll defeat the purpose, and it'll be hard to get the screw in. So when you're locating it, whether you have the rivet nut tool this way here, the squeeze riveter this way, or you're coming around more likely in this direction here, you got to make sure that the rivet die does not hit those little tangs. I guess you're going to call them tangs. And so I've got it held solid, squeeze it on down, and make sure that I haven't hit those tangs. And the anchor nut, stick it through here, still floats. It's free to move. That's important. Pull the other click out, install the second rivet, move the masking tape over, position my anchor nut. Now I gotta make sure the anchor nut sits nice and flat. I got my squeeze riveter set just in the correct location, and squeeze it on down. Two beautifully formed little anchor nut attached rivets. Pull the masking tape off the other side. I've got good flushness on this side here, and I've got a floating anchor nut, which means when I put the screw in on this side here, it's allowed to wobble a little bit or take up for any dimensional problems that I have. So it's still called a floating anchor nut because it allows the nut plate to float around when I'm screwing my screw in. And that's all there is to installing anchor nuts, which are sometimes called nut plates. And you'll just repeat the process all the way around your panel, putting one rivet at a time until all the nut plates are installed.